Hey y'all, this is Farley with the Writer's Edge podcast, and today I am privileged to be able to have a conversation with Janneman Pienaar of Piennar Saddlery. Welcome, Janneman. Happy to have you on.
Hi there. No, thanks for having me. I be happy to chat saddles and whatnot. Be fun.
Great. So kind of give me an introduction and tell me your story, kind of where you came from and where you're at today.
Well, yeah. And I grew up in the southern part of Africa. Actually, it's a pretty big country. It's called Namibia, but the population at the time was only about 1.6 million people. But the country is bigger than the size of Texas, so lot of land, very few people. So I grew up in a cattle ranch, about 300,000 acres, and you had to drive on a dirt road for 1 hour to get to the closest gas station, and the closest neighbor was 12 miles away. No electricity. And I started driving a stick shift when I was 6 years old. My dad will send me on chores. So we had to be pretty self-sufficient out there. I started, just welding and building stuff, and when stuff breaks, you have to fix it. And so I had to go to boarding school because obviously my parents were going to drive 3 hours every day to go to the closest school. And we had about 100 head of horses on the ranch. And I decided, well, I wanted to learn how to shoe them, how to train them, all that. And then there was no place to go there. I had to come pretty much to the west, where the cowboys were. So right after high school, I came to the United States, to Oklahoma, first stop, shoeing school. And then, I just ended up finding myself moving to different states, always searching out a place I can learn some aspect of the horse industry, whether it was training, shoeing. I even went to school to be a horse dentist, took classes in biomechanics and how the horse's body work. And then at some point, I don't know if I was too cheap to buy a good saddle, or maybe I figured, well, I'll do a better job than what you can find. So I built a saddle, but it wasn't very good. But that was the start of that journey where I decided to, once you make one saddle, you want to make it better, I guess. So it never ends.
I don't think anything with horses ever ends.
the story in a nutshell.
Okay.
Probably not.
So when did you start making saddles?
My first saddle I made about 16 years ago. But I really didn't know that much. I mean, I just had very few tools, a book and a video, and I just put it together. By name it was a saddle, but it's a far cry from anything great. But the reason really I wanted to do it, I was working as a professional farrier, and I saw some issues that came up with horses. So I wanted to find the source of that issue. And I happened to shoe at the barn where they had a whole bunch of Spanish horses, Andalusians, Lusitanos, that came out right out of, that came from Spain, imported. So they were the same bloodlines and managed on the same place. But the Spanish have a tradition of not riding mares and not castrating the males. So they have all these stallions standing in the barn. I think there were 9 of them, and about 20 some mares out in the fields. And I started to notice that the horses they ride, which were only the stallions, they had some similar postures that they've developed, but the mares don't have that. So I started to realize the conformation when they were born were the same, but then they develop some man-made, I guess, posture. And one thing that stood out was their front feet, the heels on the front feet started growing really excessive lengths. They started growing taller than they should be. And then the front of the feet will dish. And then not all of them, but half of them created quarter cracks, where the heel will shear off. And there were actually a couple that couldn't walk because of that shear. The blood will come out of there. And then the other noticeable thing was their cervical trapezius muscle, was that big muscle in front of the shoulder blade, was super bunched up. It was just contracted. It was like a ball sitting there. But the mares didn't have that. Same bloodline, same everything. And then, so the one common denominator was they were getting ridden, not super hard, just in the indoor basically, but they were ridden with a treeless saddle. So there's excessive pressure or localized pressure where the stirrup leather will be. So that was the beginning of me realizing, wait a minute, the saddle actually have a way bigger influence on the horses, how they use their body than we might think. So that was the kind of the beginning of the rabbit hole for me. So I've always been very interested in the function first over the looks of stuff. Like, sure. I don't care if it's that pretty, it needs to function first.
Sure.
So I decided, well, if I'm going to build saddles, I got to figure out how to build the tree, because there's only about 5 companies in this entire country that makes and sells the saddle trees.
Okay.
And there are actually, in shape, they're very, very similar. Or they create the same problems, I should say, for people. So you can call them up, say, hey, I want this and this and this. Well, they're not going to change their whole production line for one guy. I mean, they say they do, but in actuality, they don't. I've collected all the trees I could find over the years, and they're not that different, because they have these big specialized machines set up called duplicating machines, like a giant key cutter. Or they have new modern day CNC milling machines, 8-axis routers and this and that, but they don't just go and change it when somebody calls them up. That's one. And the other thing is, there's no industry standard. Everybody talks about, quarter horse or semi-quarters. I don't ever really go by that, because the one guy's semi-quarter horse might be equivalent to the next guy's full quarter horse. There is no guide, nobody, no standard. That being said, that measurement that people call the semi-quarter horse or full quarter horse, it really also can be manipulated by the width of the, probably getting ahead of myself here, but the width of the saddle tree, the stock thickness of the fork. The wider the fork, the further up that point moves to the front of the tree. So it'll measure wider. But if you cut that same fork in half, meaning the profile, make it narrower, all of a sudden that saddle tree will measure narrower, but in reality, nothing has moved. So even though you manipulate the measurements, the tree has stayed the same. So that's what I found with the tree companies. You might give them all these measurements, and they can manipulate the measurements, but the actual tree will not. The bottom part where it fits the horse will stay exactly the same from one measurement to the next. So I went on a hunt trying to learn. Sorry, say again.
No, go ahead. You're good.
So I went on a hunt trying to figure out how to make the saddle tree, but it's such kind of a, it's fairly complicated, and you need specialized equipment. So it turns out not a lot of saddle makers are actually building their own trees. There were only I mean, I maybe found 10 guys, and it was this very beginning on the internet. But I did find 10 guys, and not one single guy will teach me. Most of them said, "Oh, it's too complicated," or this or that. I did finally found a guy, and after about 2 years of, you know, really nagging him, he agreed me to come to his shop, and he kind of taught me the basics. So I took the basics of how to actually construct it, but then I took all the knowledge I learned from horseshoeing school and my, the observations I learned from this, especially that on those Spanish horses, to start building a tree that will really not affect the horse's body that much. It's some of the issues people have. And I have to say, though, horses are very noble, and they do anything you ask, like most people know. So a lot of people don't think they have a problem, but if you really start looking at horses closely, you'll see patterns emerge. And a lot of people have very similar issues, some with bigger degrees than others. So that's pretty much where I'm at today. I can recognize what somebody might be struggling with and kind of help them out as far as, changing the form to help out the horses, so the horse can preserve his best posture when you ride him. That's kind of in a nutshell there.
So you make your own trees now, and you start from the tree up, because like you just said, there's no industry standard measurement, and everybody tells you that they do something that looks slightly differently, but they kind of, a tree is a tree is a tree when you get it from a tree maker.
Exactly. And I never wanted to be just a focus on making the saddle with fancy carving and stamping. That's just, fancy leather work. I wanted to build a saddle that actually will live up to be a saddle. It's like a knife. A knife can look pretty, but first it needs to be a cutting instrument. So yeah, I've been making trees for last 16 years, and I keep trying to evolve them to do a good job. So because the tree is supposed to distribute the rider's weight and protect the horse's back. So if you take a 240-pound man, and you put him on a saddle tree, depending how the bottom of that tree is shaped, that's how it's going to distribute weight. Now, I found that a lot of trees are very long, and the bars from top to bottom are quite narrow. So inevitably, we're hitting only 4 points on the horse: the front, right on the shoulders, and then the low back, because the trees are so long and straight. Mm-hmm. So you take 240 pounds, now you have to divide it into those 4 areas, which that's a lot of pressure we're talking about. Now, the problem with hitting the front of the tree on the horse, there's right there by the withers, we have, remember how I was saying those Spanish horses, that cervical trapezius will be all bunched up? Mm-hmm. The reason for that is the scapula, that area is quite sensitive. In the top of the scapula, the shoulder blade, mm-hmm. It's all cartilage. It's actually not solid bone. And then there's actually no ligaments and absolutely no tendons holding the front legs to the rest of the horse's body. Right. A lot of people don't know this. It's just muscles. And, a muscle only does 2 things. It contracts and relaxes. So it can actually move. It'll move that scapula forward. And that's why that cervical trapezius stays bunched up, because the horse is trying to alleviate some of that pressure that we're putting in the front there on the trapezius. Because a lot of the skeletal muscles get affected. I'm mostly going to cover the skeletal muscles. So the trapezius is actually not designed to support weight. Its job is to move that shoulder. And there's also a cervical nerve that ends right in that area that kind of motors the front end. And, every major muscle group needs a good nerve to make that muscle function. And if you step on a garden hose that's running water, you cut half of it off, only half the water gets through. Same with a nerve. The signal from the brain tells the horse to move, but now you have excess pressure, yet it is moving away from pressure, because that's what horses are designed to do. They always try to find comfort, so the scapula will get sucked forward. But the moment the horse do that, the legs actually have to go back. And that's why the feet will grow tall heels in these feet, because they're standing over themselves all of a sudden. But that becomes a permanent posture. So that's one thing in a saddle tree that I was trying to change as far as the front of them go. A horse can actually bear weight on the latissimus and longissimus muscles. Those are two muscle groups that is designed to support the back. You can load the horse up there. So instead of having a long saddle tree bar, it's better off, in my mind, to shorten them and then drop them down in the middle so they can sit more on that longissimus muscle.
Mm-hmm.
And in the front of it is open it up more like a ski tip would be. So that shoulder blade and that delicate area where the cartilage is and all those nerve endings have a place, a relief to go. But I've really looked around and I couldn't find that. So that's why I decided to bolt that. But it's a kind of a complicated process to come up with a tree that way. And I think that's probably why the industry hasn't quite caught up that much. But the sort of the things I've noticed over the years, and in some disciplines it's more noticeable than others, where you see these posture changes in horses. But pretty much anytime you put too much localized pressure on the very top, like pretty much on the trapezius muscle, the horse's neck wants to get stiff,
Mm-hmm.
and the head will come up. And then the minute they do that, they will brace their whole low back area, that whole fascial plane connecting all the way back to the pelvis will sort of tighten, because that's just a response. And then it'll pull the pelvis flat to the front. And now all of a sudden the horse is hyperextended. And then you keep riding them like that. And then all that pressure from right where the front of the saddle is will drive, some of the weight will drive down. In those first thoracic vertebrae where you have the ribs coming out, there's a lot of pressure that goes down on them, connecting all the way down to the pectoral muscles. So that whole sling that's holding that horse up will sort of get stretched down. That's why you see horses develop these V necks, we call them, the
Mm-hmm.
upside down neck.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't
Yep.
born that way. There's
Right.
just from too much pressure when they get ridden with a stiff neck the head's up high. Now the pelvis gets pulled to the front, hyperextended, and then there's a muscle connecting to the base of the skull. The base of the skull, the back of the skull, all the way to the humerus, the forearm,
Mm-hmm.
called the brachiophalicus muscle, and that gets super tight in those horses. It's right here next to the windpipe, and if you touch that, they don't want you to touch that, because they're just bracing themselves. So when the head comes up, the horse can't take a long step because of that muscle.
Right.
If the neck can drop, the front foot can extend longer, and the shoulder can come up. But the shoulder can come up if the trapezius is pushed down of the saddle tree. And that's kind of the long and short of what the pressures in the front will do. But the minute you put excessive pressure in the front, the back end, like I said, seems to get hyperextended, and that's why you see a lot of like kissing spine or that hunter's bump in horses.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, a lot of that come from, it's the way the horse carry himself when you ride him. So half of it is you got to teach a horse to find a good posture, but he will never find a good posture if he's moving away from pressures that are exerted from the rider. So that's why I insist to both man on 3, basically, to try to, not put pressure where I shouldn't have it, and put more pressure where the horse can handle it, or not pressure, but more contact, I should say, over a wider area to reduce the weight impact of the rider.
Wow.
It's kind of a mouthful, but I hope that makes sense.
Oh my gosh, that made so much sense. I was like, I'm not going to interrupt him because this is awesome. Because I've never had it explained to me like that.
There's really, it's kind of difficult if it'll be easier if I have diagrams or things to refer to. So
Sure.
There's actually way more to it. I have to simplify it for people. But so, I can give more examples. Like if you go to a team roping, for instance, and you look at all these head horses, so many of them, if you look at their butts, they don't have nice butts. I'm sorry, they were born with nice butts, but all of a sudden they're in the back. A lot of especially the head horses, they are cowhocked.
Mm-hmm.
Where they turn out.
Yep.
And so that, to me, that's a man-made posture, because what happens is when they can't engage their pelvis, they start overusing their gluteus medius muscle. So right at the very top of the butt, they have those huge bulges, and then the rest of the butt is atrophied. Like when it goes towards the tail, there's no muscle almost.
Mm-hmm.
I see it all the time, and those are the biceps, and then the semi-tendinosus. So the hamstrings, they don't get used. They're actually overstretched, like a rubber band that's stretched too tight.
Mm-hmm.
And then the hip flexors of those horses, they're overused as well. The adductor magnus and all that. So they're using half their muscles in not half the other muscles. But again, I think that it comes from, the front end of the horse is not relaxed enough. The head's up tight. They put a tie down on, force it down. So the horse can't really, if you ever seen those pictures of a draft horse that looks like a slight bow,
Mm-hmm.
or like a properly trained reining horse. That's really how a horse, the head should, every degree the head comes up, the back will go down, the middle of the back.
Okay.
So every degree the neck comes up, the back goes down, which will put more pressure on 4 points only. Like if you had a saddle that fit at a standstill, and you just put a raw tree on a horse's back, and you lift the neck, all of a sudden that tree won't fit, because the higher the neck goes, the more that middle of the back will just drop away. So if you can drop that neck below the shoulders, then that mid back will come up. So there's that. But then also, if that pelvis of the horse can drop, it'll actually round that back. If the back of the pelvis can sink, the back will come up. It's not so much the horse that pull up his stomach to round his back. It's like the back of the pelvis have to drop to push the back into a round. But I don't think that happens too often. So unfortunately, like the dorsal spinous processes, the pieces of bone that stick up straight up, they face up, but they don't all face the same direction.
Right.
They lean back, and then they face straight up, and then they start leaning forward. So every time the back goes down, some of those dorsal processes will start touching each other. And then you get mineralization that happens on them. And that's what we call kissing spine. That's when the low back is kind of roached. You see it a lot. The roach, or you see that hunter's bump where that the sacroiliac ligament probably tore, and now the pelvis have shifted because those are all excessive stresses. So half of those things I think happen because the horse is just moving away from too much localized pressure off a saddle, which come from the saddle tree, and it's not distributing the weight what it should be, which is on over the rib cage on the longissimus muscle, and then keeping it away from the shoulder blades. So that scenario I've seen happening a lot, and then I think pretty much why horses get lame in the lower part of their limbs is because now those tendons and ligaments have to overwork. A horse should be 20 years old and still look like an 8-year-old horse, no atrophy, and all that. But if there's no blood supply, the muscles can't function. And the more a tree shapes a horse in the shape it's not, the less blood flow you will have, and the more atrophy you will have. So, yeah, that's my headache, trying to build trees to different shaped horses. And, every gait, the back looks different. But you got to come up with a sort of a middle ground that's where that horse is going to be happy. I mean, we can't have a perfect world, but we can sure try.
So where is your middle ground?
Well, you can't have one tree that fit all horses. That is just not possible.
Right.
I've measured enough horses' back, profiled their backs to know it's so different. What I did find though is people are like guys, and guys, they always like the same type of women, like the same kind of gal. They're always attracted to certain types. Well, people are the same with horses. They're always attracted to a certain type. So if you ever heard of 10 horses, 8 of them are going to be very similar. Maybe 2 might be oddballs. So when I build saddles to somebody, I usually figure out what type they're into. And I have my trees sort of divided into types as well. So I can fit an average of that type. But again, the middle ground I'm referring to is I'm see, a lot of people fitted a tree on a bare back, but you got to keep in mind there's a saddle pad coming, there's shearling, there's a skirting, that all changes. So keeping all of that in mind, I want to set the tree bars need to sit wide enough so we're not infringing with the spine or the nerves coming out. So sitting on the rib cage. So when I'm trying to find the angle of the rib cage. And then, of course, on top of that, there's a longissimus muscle, and then the latissimus muscle come kind of like from the shoulder slanting up towards the back, and then that's weight bearing too. So you can make the front of the bar pads lower, and then you can take the pressure off, kind of where the top of the shoulders, the wither is, and the top of the shoulder blade. That area, a saddle don't have to touch. You don't want it to touch there, but you can touch below that, lower down, because those are the ribs and the latissimus muscle that can actually support weight. So that's my middle ground. Instead, like I said, shorten the bars than having these long bars, because these new quarter horses especially, their backs are pretty short. And if you have a long bar, you're not going to fit the mid back, because the shoulders are so wide these days. So you're going to miss all that good area. Kind of like imagine where you sit when you ride bareback. That area is completely not utilized in 95% of saddles. And that's the center of gravity that's where the center of gravity for a horse is. He can carry a lot of weight there. But most saddles bridge, and that's the area they're not making contact. So, man, if you can get him to make contact there, the horse can use the rest of his back. Now, I've heard the argument before, well, if we touch him there, he can't lift his back. But I beg to differ, because most 95% of saddles don't touch there, and they can't get those horses collected. So if you can, it's more of the rear of the back that lifts, that sort of pushes up. But if you have contact there, it's not going to affect the horse as much as not having contact there and only hitting basically the scapulas. So that's where I'm at with my trees, basically. At these days.
Wow.
That's far as that's the theory on the fit. Now, the other thing I do a little different, and there's some guys that do the same, but I do, when I do the wood, I do what we call, you laminate the wood.
Okay.
So I can make the actual product a lot thinner, and it's not going to warp. Because you'll be amazed on how many saddles I've opened up, and the tree it has warped. So warped from kind of like a left to right sort of motion. So now it's totally out of square, quite a bit. So you put that back in a saddle, it might push way down on the one side of the loin and the other shoulder. So you're forcing that horse to pick up, or you're making that horse, say for instance, is twisted, one way, and you ride the horse that way. He might pick up that right lead, but not want to pick up that left lead. But maybe that tree is warped, so it dig into that side of the shoulder so much that the horse don't want to pick up that lead. And a guy just sent me a picture the other day of that very same scenario. His horse is in a resting position when he's not saddled, had these big white spots on the back of the shoulder, but the horse, that one left front leg, he will just turn out and just put out to the side. Horse is not lame, but he always stands like that. But it's not normal, but because it's just so much pressure. Obviously the white spots showed you that. But over the years, the horse has just learned to stand that way because it's more comfortable than standing correctly. So laminating the bars stabilize the wood, where you don't see in a lot of saddles. And then also fiberglass on top of that is way more like a rawhide in the old days, but that's, moisture will soften it, and then things will change again, warp on you. So that's one of the things I don't really do much these days anymore, is rawhide, for that reason.
Interesting. Oh,
yeah.
learning so much. I'm so glad we're having this conversation. This is great. Oh.
Well, it's all about the spinal, keeping the spine fit, I would say, or supple or fit. But if, like I said in the beginning, horses are designed or programmed to move away from pressure. And if you want to train one to the best of your ability and have that horse reach its potential as far as its athletic ability, if you don't start with good tools, it'll be hard to accomplish that. I mean, you can do it, and they will do it, but down the road they get lame or they get sour, and that's really why I'm doing this. Is I've developed an eye to see these patterns or see what people are struggling with, and I can, a lot of times point out. And you don't always need the new saddle. I mean, you can change padding or where you shim it, but the shimming, a lot of people have a misunderstanding of that. I realize. Really, to make shim, if you start shimming saddles, if you want to get into that, you need to bevel the shims, meaning one side needs to be thick and the other side needs to be thin. Otherwise, you might create more problems than you're actually trying to solve. If you have a shoe that doesn't quite fit right and you put a thicker sock on, it might just make the tension worse. But if you put if you put a shim in the back because the shoe is sloppy, it might push your heel forward, and then you might feel a whole lot better than just putting one big fat sock on. Same with a shim. If you already have pressure in the front and you want to lift the saddle up, well, if you put shims in, put the shims in where the bottom of the shim is full thickness, but the top, towards the top of the withers or the top of the pad, gets to where it's non-existent. It's a wedge. That'll lift your saddle up, and that'll work way better than just putting a big ass just pad in there. And I've not seen anybody anywhere using beveled shims. I've played around with it for years, but any tax shop you go into, there's just a big lump.
Yep.
It probably does some good, but I think you can do better. You start beveling them.
Makes perfect sense. Like, so frustrating because it makes, like, I always say, it's so simple. It's can make you feel stupid, right? Because, like, it's just that's a simple thing, or at least makes me, I'm like, I always get frustrated when I learn something. I'm like, that's so simple. Like, there's nothing complicated about that. But that, yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, you're right. I see it when I do stuff all the time. I'm like, for 15 years, I've been, gluing the wood together this way. And then one day I'll just like, oh, there's a way easier way. It's just, you just get in a habit in the not seeing it, I guess. But these are only a few scenarios. I mean, there are so many different things coming from that's man-made. So I always go back to you have conformation, which the horse is born that way, but posture is definitely learned behavior, and it's coming from different sources, the environment that the horse responds to. And so that's what I'm trying to minimize with the saddle, because I've definitely seen how the feet, the way the feet grew, were affected from too much pressure right on the trapezius muscle there, and the scapulas, for instance. And that was a very, very good learning experience.
Well, sure.
You couldn't deny that something was happening.
Absolutely. It just set you on this path that you're on. That's just an amazing story.
Well, it's no different, if I can use a different example of like people that wear a lot of flip-flops, they end up with low back pain.
Yep.
For instance, and that's because the flip-flop wants to fall off, so you're curling subconsciously, your toes will curl down so that you don't shoot them out when you walk. But that's tiresome. But without you thinking about it, what's called your adductor muscles will engage, so that'll turn your toe out and makes you cowhawk, just like we said about the horses.
Yep.
And then you start using your adductors to propel yourself forward instead of your glutes and your hamstring in biceps like you're supposed to. And then you end up with back troubles. It's like, well, just get rid of this stupid flip-flops, and that'll solve your back issues. Well, in a way, the saddles work the same if you change the dynamics of the pressure or how the horse. But then again, you got to come back and teach the horse to engage. That's
sure.
That's the rider's responsibility.
Sure.
After they have good equipment. Because when I used to shoe at these English barns, I heard these people say year after year, "Oh man, I got to get these horses' muscles developed." Well, it never happened. Because guess what? The saddle would sit in the same area, restricting blood flow and movement of the back. Therefore, nothing will develop. It's just impossible because, it's just atrophy. It'll stay that way. You got to change your equipment to get different results.
Yep. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Which we do in the horse industry a lot. So let's talk a little bit. Go ahead.
The horse. No, I was just going to say the horses industry, like the horses have really changed over the last, however many years.
Sure.
Like thoroughbreds was the starting point. And a lot of the trees I see today is still based on the thoroughbred type back, where the biggest thing I hear, everybody says, "Oh, my horse has no withers." It's the furthest thing away from a thoroughbred. So the horses, the breeding has really changed, but I don't think the shape of the saddles trees have changed that much over the last 50 years. And I think that's sort of part of the problems we see today. Or, and I don't want to say problems necessarily, but there's a lot of horses that can, be able to use their bodies way better, perform way better if they didn't have the pressures they had to deal with.
Oh,
whether
absolutely.
It's rodeo or cutting or reining. So that was my first. That is sort of my biggest focus. Has always been on the saddles, but then of course the saddle has many other aspects to it than just the inside.
Sure.
Once you fit the horse, you're going to make sure the person can ride it.
Yeah. So let's build up on the saddle a little bit and talk about how you fit them with the rider after, we obviously take care of the most important part, which is the horse.
Yeah. So the same thing. I just, I guess I didn't speak English when I came to this country. So I was in the habit of just not saying a word and just listening to pick up their language.
Sure.
But at the same time, I'm always just watching everything I see. So I taught myself to learn via observation, or listening to people's complaining, or whatever issue they have going on. And it started to dawn on me that women in particular always complained about their saddles, and guys didn't really say that much about it. So I started investigating as to why, and it turns out there's a very simple sort of common denominator, and that is the pelvis, because it sets up everything else. So women are not as tall as men in general, so their legs are shorter. So that was the first complaint I heard. Women always said, "Oh, I can't move my legs," because that just the whole mechanism of the fender and the way it slides over the rigging and all that was just set up for longer legs. So, and I'm not sure why it is, because most saddle makers are men, I guess, and they didn't think about that. Or in the factories, I mean, most of those people have never been on a horse or seen a horse. So whoever else set the factory production line in motion did it one day, and they never changed it. And I don't know if they listened to feedback. So the pelvis, I mean, they say if you find a skeleton, they usually look at the pelvis to figure out if it was a man or a woman.
Right.
So what I have found is a lot of ladies would say, "Oh, the saddle is too wide; it spreads me apart." And I got to think about that, and I would look at it and go, "Well, it doesn't look too wide. How can it feel like it's spreading you apart?" So I started to look at it, and I realized it's actually too narrow. That's why That's why it feels too wide. So the reason why I say that is, so if you look at the front of the pelvis, they call that the Talvik Arch. There's no legs attached, just the pelvis by itself. It's basically we just use layman's terms here, the seat bones up to the center of the pelvis is the two bones that kind of connect, and they connect with a ligament. That ligament is called the pubic symphysis, but that two bones coming together is called the pubic arch. And then there's the subpubic angle in women, so that's the angle of those two bones coming together. In average, it's 80 to 90 degrees, and in men, it's only 60 to 70 degrees. So that means the seat bones of men are quite a bit closer together than the seat bones of women, right? So if you have a seat that's too narrow, that it kind of crowns in the middle, the women's seat bone is on either side of that crown. So now it's spreading you apart. It's pulling that pubic symphysis So you're driving a wedge into yourself, basically.
Right. Okay.
So that's where you sit. That seat got to be wide, so those seat bones don't want to slide off one to the right and one to the left. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Where, because men, the seat bones are closer together, the saddle maker sitting in the saddle, oh, that feels pretty good. But you got to add more to that if it's a woman. But then now the problem is, if you have a man and a woman stand next to each other and you look at them straight on, the guy's legs will look like a railroad track. The hips, the knees, and the ankles are all straight line. It just keeps going straight on.
Yep.
Where, I mean, all women, and trust me, I've been looking at women for a long time. The hips are, a set width, and then the knees will be almost dang near touching, and then the ankles will be the same width as the hips again. And then you get exceptions to the rule, but pretty much, I mean, you watch them walk away from you, it's always that X. It looks like an X. Or when women stand in a resting position, those knees are very close to each other. And then, the inside of thighs on women seem to have more, the way the muscles are, there's just more muscle mass.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a double whammy. You have a femur from the hip to the knees that slant inwards, and with more muscle mass, like men is more lean on the inside of our legs.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a seat that's very wide in the front, that's going to spread your hips apart or open your hips up. But the problem is your knees naturally want to be close together, but now they are forced apart. But now your ankles have to come inwards, where usually your ankles want to go outward in a standing position, right?
Mm-hmm.
Normal. So if you have a seat that's too wide in front, it's pushing you in an absolute unnatural leg position. Just your legs are flexing the opposite ways they're supposed to. So yes, the seat got to be wide in the back but narrow in the front, sort of to start that process of being comfortable. The other difference is between men and women. So that same pubic arch we're talking about, the pubic symphysis, where the front part of the pelvis come together, in men, that's much higher than in women. If you measure from the bottom of the seat bone up to that point, the seat bone in men, or that place where they come together, because of that angle is so much narrower, it sits higher, which is a good thing for men because we have stuff to protect. That's why riding a bicycle or a saddle or bareback doesn't seem to bother me. Have you thought about that? Like, most men don't care. They just people that don't ride horses will go, doesn't that bother you? It's like, no, it doesn't. And that's the reason. Your bone structure come up way higher, like that arch is a lot narrower, so the pubic symphysis sits way up higher. So we can ride the saddle seat that comes up higher from the get-go, from where you sit, and it doesn't feel uncomfortable. Where in women, that it's much lower. So if you have something that comes up when you sit and it comes up steep, it's going to be running into your bone structure, and that's going to be uncomfortable.
Yep.
So, but that's a little challenging, because remember I said for women, you need the seat up front to be narrow. Well, to create narrowness, you need to build the seat up, because you can't have a flat seat that's also narrow. Then you can't fit the horse again. So that's a little bit tricky to make a really nice seat that comes in narrow but don't come up too fast for women. Now, you throw a guy in any of those saddles and he's told, oh yeah, no, it's comfortable. Oh, it feels good. But not on women.
We're complicated.
The other major well, it all stems from, there got to be a big opening for the baby's head to come through.
Right.
So that's why the bones have to be different angles for it to open up. So therefore, the coccyx, the tailbone, in women is much shorter than in guys.
Mm-hmm.
The guys, the tailbone would curl under and kind of close that gap that's there. In women, it's just kind of straight down. And sometimes it kind of, well, I've seen in some anatomy books, they make it look like it's pointing back. I don't know if that's the case or not, but it's pretty much straight down and curls in a little bit if it does curl in. But so what that does is, like in men, we can actually, if you kind of slump back a little bit, you're actually sitting on your tailbone as well as your seat bones.
Okay.
So on ladies, you can't sit on your tailbone. It's too short. You can't find it. So when we, like, if guys ride bareback, we have 3 points of contact. You have the two seat bones and the tailbone that kind of makes contact with the horse. So it's easier to sit on a horse bareback and balance yourself. Where women only have the two seat bones that's really pressing down. So you're more unstable. You rock forward or backwards. Where we have 3 points, 2 points on the side, one in the middle, which will reduce the guy's weight signature. So if you take, I don't know, I don't think anybody's ever done the actual math on this, but just common sense tell you that 3 points of contact reduce your weight impact versus 2 points of contact. So a heavier guy compared to a women counterpart, they might have the same impact on a horse's back when they ride because of the way. I'm not saying guys ride better horses, but they have the potential to reduce their weight impact. Whether they do it or not, that's a different story. The same with bareback riding. They have the potential they have an easier starting point. Whether they do it better or not, I don't know. But it is easier to start riding bareback because you're naturally more balanced just sitting. So the gluteus muscle it's a big hip flexor. That's pretty much what give your butt the shape it is. In men, because that tailbone curls under and is longer, so the gluteus muscle attached to that as well. Attachment, but that's one of them on the tailbone. Mm-hmm. But so a woman's tailbone essentially sits up higher than the guy's, so the gluteus muscle sits up higher, and then also the top part of the pelvis on women don't go up as tall as in guys. Like the pelvis on the guy is much from top to bottom measures deeper or higher. Mm-hmm. So what that does to women is it makes their butts round, where a guy has a flat butt because the muscle is stretched longer from one point to the other. And it sits more under you. Like when you're sitting more on your gluteus muscle, where on women the muscle is slightly, that's why women have nice round bubble butts. Mm-hmm. That's the sex appeal part.
Right.
Guys don't have that. But so just remember that for a minute. Then we'll go back to where the hips go into the pelvis, the ball joint. Mm-hmm. Now right below that ball, there's a piece of the pelvis, the structure that goes down, which becomes what we call the seat bone. Now in men, that pretty much goes straight down, that bone from the hip down, it goes straight or slightly forward, where in women, that bone will angle to the back slightly. So bear in mind that's your seat bone, but your seat bone going up, it goes forward from the ball joint, it angles back. So what it wants to do is it naturally, when you sit, like on a saddle, for instance, your pelvis wants to roll forward because of the way that angle is right there. Okay. Where in guys, your pelvis wants to roll backwards. So that's why if you walk around where there's a lot of riders, you always see guys slump, It's easy for a guy to slump because it's just, your pelvis roll back and your whole spine just collapse. Mm-hmm. Where women, it's hard for women to slump, believe it or not. They don't just slump like guys do. Like for guys to sit upright you have to actually engage your muscle. It's work.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why guys, don't look that good on a horse a lot of times, because they're like, slumped, where women are way more erect because their pelvis wants to roll forward, which keeps them up.
Mm-hmm.
So the pelvis wants to roll forward sitting in a saddle. But also remember that gluteus muscle that sits a little higher and sticks out a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a cantle that comes up real steep, now your pelvis already wants to roll forward, and that bubble butt keeps hitting the top of the cantle, that gluteus muscle.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's pushing your pelvis even more forward. So now you have a double whammy against you. Pelvis wants to roll forward. But if the pelvis rolls forward, the low back has to arch the other way. Now you have a lordosis. That low back is curled in,
Right.
curved to make up for the rolling of the pelvis. And then your whole upper body will completely be out of sync with the rest of its muscles. I mean, you will not have any core strength or any sort of balance. You don't see a tightrope walker, with an arch back or slumping, or a unicycle rider or whatever. The low back is straight, always straight. And when your low back is straight, you don't have any troubles. Well, you might have troubles balancing, but you give yourself the best shot to engage your core strength, which will also allow you to be balanced.
Right.
So if you have all these small seats that everybody think is so good for them, if you look at, and I'm not picking on women here, I'm just kind of pointing out that I've seen ladies rope, for instance, and they go forward and they go backwards the whole time trying to swing the rope. And they don't even know they're doing that. But it's because they can't find balance. They're not in balance. They're fighting to come back to gain power. But if the low back were in a place where the pelvis wouldn't roll forward and the low back come out of the pelvis dead straight, they'll have so much more power and not falling forwards and backwards. Or when the horse spook, you will just keep going with the horse. And all these things, you can test with muscle testing to show you if you're in balance or not. Or ride a unicycle and you will really find out you can't, mess around with pushing the pelvis certain ways. There's only one place, and that's that neutral position.
Right.
So long story short, a lot of saddles is not set up to support that female pelvis because of those things that we're talking about. The seat bones in the female sits further back because of that angle. So the pelvis wants to roll forward. In men, it sits further forward. So they sit in a different part of the saddle. Pelvis wants to roll back. And then because of the wide stance of guys, basically through their knees, they don't care if the saddle is narrow or wide. They will always tell you, no, it feels fine. But the women won't tell you that. They will say it's too wide, usually. Now, you get exceptions to the rule, but in general, that has been a thing that I've been addressing. And people seem to, they don't even always know they're falling back forward or that it's an issue. But I've put people, taken them out of what they're used to and then put them in a proper seat, and they ride and then they realize instantly how much more secure they feel. They look taller in the saddle. You're not so compressed, because when that low back, becomes dumpy, your whole body sags down, and you're just not feeling secure. You might have a tall cantle or a tall front end in your saddle. You're still not going to feel secure if your low back is not straight and your pelvis is sitting not locked in, but you can just sit in a little bowl basically,
right,
and kind of rotate like almost like a ball and socket joint. So that's the biggest major difference between how a guy in a gal might ride or sit in a saddle, I guess.
Oh,
Does that make sense?
makes so much sense. I love this. So much knowledge being dropped in one conversation. I love it.
So basically, if I don't make two kinds of seats, I make one seat.
Okay.
There's always only one seat I built, but it's gonna work for ladies. And then you put a guy in it, and they love it too,
Okay.
because they don't know any better. But it's true. But you can't change. You can't do it vice versa. You can't make it where the guys love it, women will hate it, almost always.
Okay.
But yeah, and of course, I like watch the battle. People do battle racing, and they all want these little tiny itty bitty saddles
Mm-hmm.
to feel secure in. Or the ropers. I never understand it, because you look at pictures that are caught in different stages of what they're doing,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll find the rider completely out the saddle. They'll be over the front end of the saddle or out the back end. And that makes sense, because if you have such a short base to ride in, and it goes up either end, it will shoot you out of there.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then you get these leg cuts they put in the swells. Well, guess what? They're trying to make the saddle bigger, or they make the cantle, the width of the cantle from left to right, narrower. That creates more thigh room. They're trying to make the saddle bigger again.
Uh-huh.
So they're all the factories, especially, they're trying to make these saddles bigger. But if they make a 16-inch saddle, nobody will buy it. So I've come to find that most of these ropers and battle races, a 14-inch actually is original, more like a 16-inch saddle, the seat shape, the size, because they make the cantles very steep, meaning the base of the bottom of the cantle is pushed backwards to create more room.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so all I had to do, you could take in. So I think the reason is because people felt like they were behind the horse's motion.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why they rode a smaller seat. But all you had to do really is move the stirrup leathers back a little bit when you build a tree. Then the rider will be more with the motion of the horse. And if you put a proper seat in, if a horse do a violent movement, you'll be more secure, I think, than a smaller seat size. Until you really experience that, people might argue. But if you look at bronc riders, bronc saddles, they are not little tiny seats where they lock themselves in. Same with cutting horses. They don't have these short little seats. And those are two disciplines that really have violent movements. And those riders are fairly balanced and still during the ride. So you got to learn from that. So, you can still make a saddle that measure bigger with a proper seat, and it'll ride small. So I think people will be better off finding saddles. Perhaps a good move will be for women, especially, is finding a little bigger seats where that pelvis is not forced forward by the cantle because of your gluteus muscles, especially if you have a nice butt.
Interesting.
I would say.
Interesting. You're going to have a lot of women that are listening right now. They're going to say, I'm sticking to my seat size like I'm sticking to my bra size. It's not changing. And it's going to be a lot of resistance, but everything that you have said makes so much sense. Because even I'm sitting here going, well, and I got to go look at my stuff.
Well, I'm kind of used to it, but I have a lot of return customers.
Sure.
Once they experience this, they want a second one, because they got, man, I just delivered a saddle, and the person's like, man, I've been missing out for so long. And you can still have a tall cantle. I'm not saying you can't have a tall cantle, but the way they make them, especially in the factories, they make them very, very steep, like straight up. Mm-hmm. You can still have a tall cantle, but you can angle it back. So there's a nice steady rise to it, especially for women, I would say, because the bottom, just right behind your seat bones, you don't have a lot of support there. With guys, we have more support because the gluteus muscle is lower. So we can actually ride a steep cantle easier than women, and actually will help some guys from slumping. So you almost need the opposite there. But there's some muscle testing I do with people so if your low back is arched and you push somebody on their forehead when they sit on their saddle, or you push them behind the shoulder blades from the back, all of a sudden you'll push them plumb down, like they'll fall on the horse's neck if you just push them all of a sudden.
Right.
If they're not expecting that.
Right.
Or if they hold their hand out straight in front of them and you push on their hand, you'll just push them down and their whole front end will come down, the whole body. But if they're sitting in a neutral power position, you can push them on the shoulder blades or the forehead, whatever. That person they won't move much because their core is engaged. So they're not going to rock, But if you translate that to riding, you can see the benefits of more secure, or if you're more balanced, the horse won't have all that dead weight it's carrying. Or if you're roping, you will be way stronger coming out of your shoulders, for instance. I mean, the benefits are all there.
Absolutely.
So proper seat size has a lot to do with your ability to ride correctly. Like I said, unfortunately, a lot of saddles, if the seat size get bigger, they make the bars of the saddle longer, which creates bridging problems again for the horse. So that's why it's good to do a lot of research and try to find, a saddle that have all the built-in stuff, like the proper seat for the person, and then also the proper fit for the horse.
Right.
And then, there, like I said in the beginning, there's no industry standard. Everybody argues with each other about this stuff.
Sure.
But if people know their horses and how they ride, and if they can experience something different and beneficial, they will recognize that right away. And that's sort of probably the best testimony. If people feel like they've become a better rider just by changing their tack, or they can notice their horse move differently or more sound. And those are the kind of feedback I get a lot of times. I've also built a lot of endurance saddles, like hundreds of them. And those horses go 100 miles a day sometimes.
Right.
And that's kind of where I learned a lot about the saddle fit stuff, because they get pulled off every 20 miles or so and get checked by a veterinarian to make sure the backs are not sore.
Okay.
A whole host of, there's a whole host of other stuff that they check for.
Sure.
But I was lucky enough to kind of experiment and see what works and what doesn't work. But yeah, you gotta not have a 3-bar that's too long. Oh, another thing I hear a lot of people say is, my horse, the saddle's too long, that's why I ride a short seat. But you gotta remember, what you see on the outside is not where the tree is. The tree is only so long. Then you have the skirt sticking out past that, front and back. Now, as most custom makers, about at least 80% of them, you should do what they call blocking the skirts. So where the bar end, in front and back, you push the skirt almost 90 degrees up, and then it gets bent back to follow the plane of the horse. So even though the saddle looks long, it shouldn't interfere with the movement of the muscles in the hips if you do it correctly. But a lot of, especially factory saddles, they don't block the skirts. So they just put a flat piece of leather under the tree, right? And then, so that just keeps extending. And that's why some people don't like it, because it'll rub the hair off the center of the horse's back, or the horse's hip will keep running into the skirt. But if you block it, it should move some degree, almost not quite an inch, but it'll move up and then over. So it should have no bearing on how long the saddle is. The tree is much shorter, and that's what distributes the weight. So that's one thing I always have to explain to people. Yeah, block skirts on a custom tree is so much nicer on a saddle. I mean, because you can have long looking saddle, but it won't interfere with your horse's movement.
Sure.
Those are the extra little things. Yeah, that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
Oh, such a great conversation today. I appreciate your time so much. So,
yeah, I mean, I like talking about this kind of thing anytime. And there's so much I left out. I'm sure it's gonna hard to keep track of what I said or not. But I'll be happy to, especially if people have questions or complaints, I can clarify things at a different time too.
Sure. How
no, be happy to.
If people give us where we can find you if people want to follow up after this conversation with clarification or other conversations, how do they get a hold of you?
Well, so I'm super old school, meaning I have a very visceral objection to writing.
Okay.
I did that all through my school. I could never write anything. And to this day, it's very hard to me to actually even do a text. It's just, it seems like work, but I don't mind, talking on the phone. I do have a website. It's my initials, jpsaddles.com.
Okay.
And my phone number is there somewhere.
Okay.
Yeah, so people they can call me. Now the website is nothing special. You won't find anything on there. It's like 10 years old, never been updated. So but my phone number is there. Just call me.
Okay. But you have you have a Facebook page as well too. Yes?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I have a page. It's I don't even go on there. I think it's called Janneman Pienaar Custom Saddles.
Okay.
Should be. But I should put more stuff on there too, I guess.
Well, we'll link this conversation up there for you.
Yeah, that'd be good. Thank you. That'd be great.
Well,
so yeah, hopefully I made sense through this accent of mine.
Oh, your accent was great. No, that everything made sense, and just wonderful knowledge and conversation you shared today. I appreciate you so much for taking the time to talk about all of that. And I have a feeling we will talk
that works.
more.
Yeah, no, that could be anytime. I mean, I've been threatening to because I've known a lot of this and I keep evolving it. I've known it for a long time, and then, like I said, I keep adding to it for a better understanding. And I share it with some of my customers, but I don't really hear too many other people talk about it. So I don't mind sharing the sort of some of the stuff, and hopefully it can help people down the line, making their horses and their riding experience happier and improve that.
Absolutely. Anything we can make the horse, if we can make things better for the horse, I'm all for it.
Yeah, well, I see so many horses with back problems in different, it's just so common, and horses just put up with it. They're really noble. They will work and work and work and not care, but deep down in there they must be sore or having a hard time. So I'm just doing my little part the best I can.
Well, thank you for coming on today, and we will chat again soon.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thanks for having me, and happy trails.
Thank you for listening to the Rider's Edge podcast today. We appreciate your time and attention. Thank you for always helping us move the conversation forward. If you liked today's podcast, please help us keep the conversations going by subscribing to this podcast, and consider leaving us a review so others can find us and join in on the conversations. You can also find more information by checking us out on our social media channels, including Facebook at Riders Edge Therapy and Wellness, Instagram at Riders Edge Therapy, and our website, www.ridersedgetherapy.com. It is there that you can book a consult for either you or your horse. Thank you, and as always, we will see you down the road.